The dead man's handwriting was barely legible. The ink faded to the color of old rust, but Louise Shelton had read the name so many times across 300 miles of frozen territory that she could have traced it blindfolded in the dark. Abraham Trask, Sweetwater Creek, New Mexico Territory, and those 4 words had kept her alive through blizzard and hunger, and the particular loneliness of a woman traveling alone in the winter of 1878. She had not wanted to come. That was the truth she kept folded inside her chest like a letter she was not ready to send. When the solicitor in Kansas City had pressed the will into her hands and explained in his measured, careful voice that her uncle, Clement Shelton, had died in October without a wife or children to his name, and that he had left his property 60 acres, a farmhouse, and a small herd of cattle, to a man named Abraham Trask in New Mexico Territory, Louise had laughed, not because anything was funny. She had laughed because the alternative was to cry, and she was 24 years old, and she had already done enough crying that year to last her the rest of her life. Her own circumstances had not been comfortable. Clement had been her last living relative, and though she had not seen him in 7 years, she had carried a quiet, enduring hope that someday she might travel west and stand on his porch and have him tell her she had done well enough on her own. That hope was gone now. In its place was a legal document and a name she did not recognize, and a solicitor who explained, with the gentlest possible tone, that under the terms of the will, the property could not be transferred until a blood relative of the deceased had personally delivered the deed to the named beneficiary. There was only one blood relative. She was looking at the solicitor with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her jaw set, and she already knew what she was going to do before he finished the sentence. She had sold what little she owned in Kansas City, a small collection of furniture, a sewing kit that had belonged to her mother, 2 dresses she had no use for in the winter, and she had bought a horse. The horse's name was Birch, and he was a gray gelding with a broad chest and a steady temperament, and she had loved him on sight because he looked as though he had already survived several difficult things and intended to survive several more. She had packed dried meat and hardtack and 2 wool blankets and a flask of brandy she intended for emergencies, and she had ridden south and west into the darkest months of the year, because the solicitor had told her that the property taxes on Clement's land were due in the spring, and the deed could not be held in legal limbo past March, and it was already the middle of November. The territory was not kind in December. She crossed the Cimarron River on a morning when the surface was half frozen, and the horse went in up to his knees, and she went in up to her thighs, and the cold was so immediate and absolute that she did not feel it as cold but as something closer to grief. She dried herself by a fire she built in a hollow of red rock, and she ate hardtack and drank a careful measure of the brandy, and looked at the will by firelight, and said the name out loud to nobody. Abraham Trask. She wondered if he was old or young, mean or gentle, and whether he would know immediately what to do with 60 acres and a farmhouse, or whether the news would strike him sideways the way unexpected things always do. She arrived in the town of Mesilla in the 2nd week of December, and the town was strung with cold and quiet, the streets rutted and frozen, the horses at the hitching post standing with their heads low and their breath making small clouds in the gray air. She stopped at the general store and asked after Sweetwater Creek, and the man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow with a red beard and an apron dusted with flour, told her it was another 30 miles north and east along a road that was barely a road at all once the snow came. He looked at her horse and then at her and then back at the horse. "You traveling alone?" he asked, and it was not quite a question. "I am," Louise said, and she said it with the particular tone she had developed over the past month, the one that invited no further comment. He sold her a fresh sack of dried beans and a pound of coffee, and told her to follow the creek bed north until it forked, then take the eastern branch until she saw a stand of 3 cottonwoods at the top of a rise, and the Trask property would be just below it. She thanked him and went back out into the cold and remounted Birch and kept going, because stopping had never been the thing she was built for. The last day of riding was the worst. The wind came out of the northwest carrying snow that was not quite falling, but was not quite not falling either. More a kind of suspension of cold white particles in the air that reduced visibility to the length of a few horses and made the world feel very small and very close. Louise rode with her face buried in the collar of her coat and her hands so stiff on the reins that she could not be certain she was holding them at all, only that the horse continued in the right direction, because she had pointed him there an hour ago, and Birch was sensible about these things. She found the cottonwoods in the late afternoon, when the light was already going orange and thin at the horizon. 3 of them, exactly as the man had said, standing leafless and stark against the sky at the top of a rise, their white bark almost luminous in the failing light. She stopped Birch and looked down the slope and saw it a farmhouse with a barn beside it, a fence line running south, smoke rising from a chimney in a thin, straight column that told her the air was finally still. There were lights in the windows. Someone was home. She sat on the horse for a moment longer than she needed to, and she was not sure why. Perhaps because she had been moving for so long that stopping felt dangerous. Perhaps because she understood in some inarticulate way that this moment, the moment just before, was the last moment in which she would be entirely the person she had been for the past month. Solitary, purposeful, without complication. She tucked the wool back inside her coat and urged Birch down the slope. The gate was wooden, 2 rails crossed and latched with a loop of rope, and as she approached it in the last gray light of the afternoon, a man stepped out of the barn. He was tall, not in the exaggerated way of men who want you to know it, but in the natural way of someone who has always been that height and has stopped thinking about it. He wore a canvas coat and a dark hat and boots that were worn at the heel, and he was carrying a lantern that threw a circle of warm yellow light around him. He saw her before she reached the gate, and he stopped walking and held the lantern a little higher, and she could see his face clearly in the light. He was not old. She had not let herself imagine what he might look like, but she had somehow expected old, and he was not. He looked to be perhaps 30, with a jaw that was dark with several days of beard and dark eyes that were watching her with the careful attention of a man who lived alone and did not often receive visitors. He was not handsome in the practiced way of men who know they are handsome. He was handsome in the way of a landscape, the kind of face that had weather in it and character and something she did not have a word for yet. "You the Trask place?" she called, and her voice came out steadier than she expected it to. "I am," he said, and the phrasing struck her as funny and strange because it was the same answer she had given the man in Messilla, and she almost smiled. He came to the gate and unlooped the rope and swung it open for her, and she rode Birch through and dismounted in the yard, and they stood facing each other in the lamplight while the cold pressed in around them on all sides. "Abraham Trask?" she asked. "That is me," he said. He was looking at her with an expression that was not unwelcoming but was careful, as though he was waiting for information before he decided what to feel. "And you would be?" "Louise Shelton," she said. "Clement Shelton was my uncle. He died in October." She reached inside her coat and drew out the will, folded into its thirds and worn soft at the creases from all the times she had opened and refolded it. "He left you his land in Kansas. 60 acres, a farmhouse, and a herd. I have the deed. I am required to deliver it in person." She held it out to him. Abraham Trask looked at the will in her hand, and then he looked at her face, and something shifted in his expression that she could not read. He did not take the will immediately. He said, "You rode from Kansas." "From Kansas City," she said. "I have been on the road since the 15th of November." He looked at her horse, and then at the dark horizon from which she had come, and then back at her face, and his expression shifted again into something that was clearly concerned this time, unguarded and immediate. "In December," he said. "The taxes are due in the spring," she said. "There is a legal deadline." "You rode 300 miles alone in December to deliver a piece of paper," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I did," she said, and she meant it to sound practical, but it came out sounding something else, something she could not name, and the wind picked up just then and she shivered despite herself. He was quiet for one more moment, and then he said, "Come inside. Your horse needs hay and water, and you need food and a fire." She followed him into the barn first, and she watched him settle Birch in a stall with competent, easy movements, fresh hay, a bucket of water, a cursory but thorough look at the horse's legs and hooves. He treated Birch with the same matter-of-fact care she had given the horse herself, and she felt a small, irrational gratitude for this, as though the horse's well-being was a test she had not known she was administering and he had passed. The house was small but solid, built of adobe with thick walls that held the warmth well. There was a fireplace taking up most of one wall, and it was burning well, and the heat hit her like something physical when she walked through the door. There was a kitchen table and 2 chairs, and a cast-iron stove and shelves along the walls holding neatly organized provisions. Everything was clean and simple, and arranged by someone who lived carefully. She stood in the middle of the room and let the warmth come into her hands and face, and she was surprised to find that her eyes were stinging. "Sit down," Abraham Trask said from behind her. "I will heat something." She sat. She put the will on the table between them like a diplomatic document. He moved around the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a man who cooked for himself and had made his peace with it. And within 20 minutes, there was a bowl of venison stew in front of her and a cup of hot coffee, and she ate without speaking for several minutes, because the food was the best thing she had tasted in a month, and she did not trust herself to talk and eat at the same time. He sat across from her with his own coffee and watched her eat, and when she finally looked up she found that his expression had settled into something that was thoughtful and warm and slightly bewildered. "You said Clement Shelton was your uncle," he said. "He was," she said. "My mother's brother. He went west before I was born. I met him twice, once when I was 12 and once when I was 17. He was a good man, quiet. He sent letters sometimes." She paused. "I did not know he was sick until the solicitor sent word." Abraham was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup between his hands. "He came through here 4 years ago," he said. "He was heading north, had lost his horse in a river crossing, and I let him stay while he got a new one. He stayed 3 weeks. We talked a great deal. He was a very good man." He looked at the will. "I did not know he thought of me this way." "It seems he did," Louise said. "I do not need the land," Abraham said, and he said it not carelessly but carefully, as though wanting her to understand something. "I have my own land here, 40 acres. It is enough." "You can sell it," she said, "or lease it. The deed will be yours to do with as you choose once I transfer it." She paused. "I only needed to bring it to you. That was the condition." He was looking at her now with an attention that was different from how he had been looking at her before. Less careful, more direct. "You could have sent it by post," he said. "There was a legal requirement for in-person delivery," she said. "Is that the only reason you came yourself?" he asked. She looked at him across the table, and the fire popped once in the hearth, and the wind moved against the outside of the house, and she thought about the question honestly before she answered. "No," she said. "I think I also wanted to see the place my uncle loved, and I had nothing keeping me in Kansas City." She said the last part plainly, without self-pity, which was how she preferred to say difficult things. Something moved across his face then, something open and recognizing, like a man who has just heard a sentence in his own language after a long time in a foreign country. He said, "I have a spare room. There is a bed and blankets. You should stay tonight and rest before you ride." "I will pay you for the hospitality," she said immediately. "You will not," he said, and there was a quiet finality to it that settled the question. She slept that night in a way she had not slept in a month, deeply and without waking, in a room that smelled of cedar and clean wool. And when she woke in the morning, the sun was already well up, and she could hear the sounds of the yard outside, the soft movement of horses, the clank of metal on metal, the particular rhythm of someone who knows their work. She dressed and came out and found the table set with cornbread and coffee, and a small crock of honey, and Abraham Trask was just coming in from outside with cold air still on him, and he looked at her the way a man looks at someone he has been thinking about and said, "There is no rush to leave today. The road north is rough and the weather looks uncertain." "I do not want to impose," she said. "You are not imposing," he said. "Sit down and eat." She sat down and ate, and they talked. They talked through the morning and into the afternoon, and it happened the way it does when two people have been alone long enough that honest conversation feels like water to the thirsty. She told him about Kansas City, about the years after her parents had died of typhoid in the summer of 1874, about the work she had done seamstress, bookkeeper, a brief and disastrous attempt at teaching, and about the restlessness she had always felt, the sense that the life she was living was a holding pattern rather than the real thing. He told her about New Mexico, about how he had come from Tennessee at 22 with a brother who had died of a fever the following winter, about the years of building the farm alone, about the particular quality of the silence out here that was different from any silence he had known before. "Is it lonely?" she asked. He considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he said, "there is a kind of loneliness that is peaceful and a kind that is not. I have had both. This past year has been more of the peaceful kind." He paused, "though I could not have told you why until this morning." She looked at her coffee cup because looking at him felt too direct just then. That afternoon he showed her the farm. The 40 acres spread south and east from the house, the land red and amber and gold in the winter light, patched with scrub and dry grass and the occasional juniper. He kept a small herd, 8 cattle, currently, and a vegetable garden that was dormant under the cold, and a pen of chickens that were producing through the winter, because he had built their coop on the south side of the barn where the sun caught it. He explained each thing not with the pride of performance, but with the satisfaction of someone who has solved difficult problems over a long period and is glad the solutions hold. Louise walked beside him and looked at everything carefully and asked real questions, and Abraham Trask answered them and asked her things in return. And by the time they came back to the house, as the light was going the color of embers, she realized that she had not once thought about leaving. Over dinner, beans and salt pork and more cornbread, which she was beginning to suspect he made well enough that it was his primary contribution to the culinary arts, she said, "My uncle never told you he intended to leave you his land." "Not once," Abraham said. "He only talked about Kansas as a place he had come from. He talked more about family. He talked about a niece he was proud of." He looked at her steadily, a niece who had more backbone than most men he had known. Louise set down her fork. "He said that." "He did," Abraham said. "He said you were the best of the Shelton blood and that he regretted not staying in touch." A pause. "He also said you had your mother's eyes." Her eyes were filling, and she was furious at herself for it, but she could not stop it entirely. She pressed her lips together and looked at the window and the dark outside pressed against the glass, and she heard him say quietly, "I am sorry. I should not have said it so suddenly." "No," she said, steadying herself. "I am glad you told me." She wiped the corner of one eye with the back of her hand quickly. "I am glad he spoke of me." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, and then she said, "What will you do with his land, honestly?" Abraham turned his coffee cup in a slow circle. "I have been thinking about it since you put that will on the table last night," he said. "There is a family, the Ramos family. They farm 3 miles east of here. Eduardo Ramos has 3 sons and 2 daughters, and they are crowded on 20 acres. I would give it to them." Louise looked at him. "Give it." "They could not buy it," he said simply, "and they deserve it. Eduardo has been farming this territory since before it was a territory. His family has been here for 2 generations. He paused. "The law does not always give people what they have earned. Sometimes a man can do it himself." She studied him across the table with an attention she did not bother to hide, and what she saw was something she had not expected to find at the end of 300 miles of frozen road, a man who was good. Not perfectly good, not performing goodness, but genuinely and quietly good in the way that only comes from having thought about things honestly and acted on what you found. "Then we will do that," she said, and she said we without thinking, and neither of them mentioned it. She stayed another day, and then another. She told herself it was the weather, and the weather was genuinely uncertain, a gray and restless sky that suggested snow but did not commit to it. She told herself it was because she had nowhere to go, which was also true. But she also stayed because she wanted to, and she had decided some time ago that pretending not to want things was a waste of energy she could not afford. On the third day, Abraham rode with her to the Ramos place. It was a low house set in a fold in the land, sheltered from the north wind, with a yard full of the comfortable mess of a large and active family tools, and a saddle on a fence rail, and a wagon with one wheel removed and propped on a block. Eduardo Ramos was a man in his late 40s with a white-threaded black beard and the hands of someone who had spent 40 years in the soil. And when Abraham explained why they had come, the man was silent for a long moment in the way of someone who is deciding whether to trust an extraordinary piece of news. His wife, Catalina, came out of the house and stood in the yard listening, and her face did something complicated and private that Louise recognized as the face of a person who has hoped for something for a long time without allowing themselves to fully believe it might arrive. "I cannot accept this without payment," Eduardo said. "You can," Abraham said, "and you will. I have no use for Kansas land, and you have 5 children who need more room. That is the whole argument." Eduardo looked at Louise because the deed was hers to transfer. She nodded. "My uncle's intent was for Mr. Trask to have it," she said. "Mr. Trask's intent is that you have it. I will sign whatever is necessary." She paused. "It is good land. My uncle took care of it." Eduardo Ramos extended his hand to Abraham, and Abraham shook it. And then Eduardo looked at Louise and took off his hat, which was the most formal gesture the situation could contain, and she understood that it was a great deal. On the way back, she and Abraham rode side by side in the cold, clear air, and she was aware of him beside her with a physical awareness that was new, the warmth of another person at close range after so much solitude, the sound of his horse's feet beside birches on the frozen ground. "That was a generous thing," she said. "It was the right thing," he said, as though the distinction mattered. "They are the same sometimes," she said. He looked at her, and the look lasted a moment longer than it needed to. "Yes," he said, "sometimes they are." That evening after dinner she was helping him wash the dishes, which she had simply begun doing without asking permission, and the domestic ease of it struck her as something she had not felt in a very long time. Her shoulder was close to his arm as they stood at the basin. The fire crackled and threw light across the floor. Outside, the wind was finally delivering on its promise of snow, and she could hear it against the windows. "The road will be difficult tomorrow," he said. "Yes," she said. "And the day after," he said. "Likely," she said. "You are welcome to stay," he said, and his voice was careful again, the way it had been at the gate 3 days ago, the tone of a man offering something genuine and not certain of the reception. She handed him the last dish to dry and turned to look at him directly. He was close. The lamplight made his face warm and shadow-marked, and his eyes were on hers with an expression that was waiting and open and honest. "Abraham," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name without the surname, and they both noticed it. "Louise," he said quietly. "I am not staying because of the weather," she said. He held the damp dish in both hands and looked at her, and something settled in his expression like a man coming home. "I know," he said. "I do not know what I am staying for," she said, "except that I want to, and I have spent a long time doing things I did not want to do, and I am tired of it." "Then stay," he said. "As long as you want to," she nodded. The snow was picking up outside. The fire was warm. She turned back to the basin to drain the water, and his hand covered hers on the basin's edge for one brief moment, not taking, not demanding, just touching, the way you touch something to make sure it is real, and then he stepped back and hung the dish towel on its hook and asked if she wanted more coffee. Yes, she said, and she meant much more than coffee. The snow lasted 2 days and came down in the patient, relentless way of a territorial winter, filling in the yard and the fence posts and the space between the barn and the house, until the world was reduced to white and gray and the warm gold rectangle of the kitchen window. Louise spent those 2 days in the house, and they were the least lonely 2 days she had experienced in years. She read from the small stack of books on Abraham's shelf, a Bible, a volume of Emerson, a technical manual on cattle husbandry that she found surprisingly engaging, while he worked at the table on accounts and repairs. They talked when conversation arose and were comfortable in the silences between, which she had learned was the true test of good company. She found, piece by piece, the details of the man she was coming to know. He had been educated by a determined mother who believed reading was the primary human necessity. He had a particular affection for horses that bordered on the philosophical. He talked about Birch the first morning, with the same care and specificity he used when talking about his own animals. He was a careful cook, but not a creative one, and he ate the same rotation of 4 or 5 dishes with the equanimity of a man who has categorized food as fuel, without quite being able to sustain the conviction when someone else put something interesting on the table. On the second evening of the snowstorm, she cooked. She found dried chilies and lard and corn flour and a piece of smoked bacon in his stores, and she made something she had learned from a Mexican woman in a boarding house in Kansas City, a kind of thick stew with corn cakes, and when she put it in front of him, he looked at it with the expression of a man encountering something he had not known he was missing. He ate 2 full bowls and looked up and said, "Where did you learn that?" "From a woman named Esperanza Garcia," Louise said. "She was the best cook I have ever known, and she charged $3 a week for board, which was the best $3 I ever spent." She paused. "She also taught me to swear in Spanish, though I will not demonstrate that." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, not the controlled amusement she had seen before, but an actual laugh, unprepared and warm, and it changed his whole face, took 10 years off it, made him look young and surprised. She looked at him across the table and felt something catch in her chest, the way it does when you see something beautiful when you are not expecting to. "You are remarkable," he said, and he said it simply, not as a compliment but as an observation, the way you say the sun is coming up. "I am not," she said. "You are," he said, 300 miles alone in December. You arrived at my gate with a legal document in your coat and your horse's legs clean and your back straight, and you ate and slept and were ready to talk by morning. Most men would have been broken by the first 2 weeks. He was looking at her with that direct, waiting attention that she had been learning to read, and what she read in it now was clear. "I am not saying it to flatter you. I am saying it because it is the truth and you should know it." She looked at her own hands on the table. They were hands that had worked, not elegant hands, but capable ones, with a small scar on her left index finger from a needle, and her nails cut short and practical. She was not accustomed to being seen. She was accustomed to being useful, which was a different thing, and it took her a moment to find the ground under her. "My uncle saw it," she said quietly, "and apparently so did you." She looked up. "That is 2 people I know of." "That is more than you are giving yourself credit for," Abraham said. The snow stopped on the morning of the 3rd day, and the world came back brilliant and white and exact, each fence post and branch outlined in snow with a jeweler's precision, and the sky was the deep and cloudless blue that exists only after winter weather has finished with an idea and moved on. Louise stood on the porch and looked at it and breathed the cold air, and Abraham came out behind her with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside her. "I should transfer the deed formally," she said. "Do you know if there is a land office in Mesilla?" "There is," he said. "We can ride in when the road is clear enough, 2 days perhaps." She took her coffee from him and their fingers touched briefly on the cup. "What happens after that?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to happen?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and the morning light was clean and cold and honest, and she thought, here is a man who asks the direct question. Here is a man who does not speak around things. Here is a man who, in 4 days, has cooked for her and cared for her horse, and given away a Kansas farm to a family who needed it and laughed at her table and told her the truth. And she was standing on his porch in the aftermath of a snowstorm, and she was 30 years from dead, and the world was white and new, and she was done pretending. I do not know what I want to happen in the large sense, she said. In the small sense, I want to drink this coffee and stand here for a while and then go feed Birch. He smiled. It was not the full laugh she had heard the night before, but it was related to it, a first cousin. And in the medium sense? He asked. She looked at him sideways. In the medium sense, she said, I want to stay here longer than is strictly necessary. A pause. If that is amenable to you. Very amenable, he said. Good, she said, and turned back to the white yard and the blue sky and drank her coffee. They rode to Mesilla 3 days later when the road had firmed up enough under the cold. It was a full day's ride, and Abraham rode beside her on a red roan mare named Patience, which he said had been named for the quality she had cost him the most of in training her. Louise liked the story and told him so, and they spent the first hour of the ride in the easy conversation of two people who have been talking honestly for a week and have not yet come close to running out of things to say. The land office in Mesilla was run by a man named Porter, who was thin and precise, and looked at Louise's paperwork with the attention of someone who enjoyed complexity and was glad it had walked through his door. He verified the will, examined the deed, asked Louise a series of questions about her relationship to the deceased that she answered clearly and without impatience, and then produced the necessary transfer documents and arranged for a formal letter to be sent to the county assessor in Kansas. The legal transfer of Clement Shelton's 60 Kansas acres to Abraham Trask took 45 minutes and cost $12 in filing fees, which Abraham paid from his coat pocket without hesitation, and Louise reimbursed him for later that evening over her formal protest and his formal acceptance. They had lunch at a small restaurant near the center of Mesilla, and Louise had her first hot meal that someone else had made in 3 weeks, and she ate with great contentment and looked out the window at the street. Mesilla was a real town, with a proper plaza and a church and a mercantile and a small hotel, and the streets had the layered quality of a place where several different kinds of people had been living alongside each other for generations. Mexican families who had been here before the American acquisition, Anglo settlers who had come after, Texan cattlemen passing through. She had seen this layering in other territorial towns and found it more honest than the places that pretended to be simpler than they were. My uncle was happy here, she asked. Abraham considered this. He was at peace, he said. That is not quite the same thing. Happy is a word for people who have not thought too hard. Peace is what you find after. He paused. He missed family. He told me that. He had been alone a long time by then. So have you, she said. Yes, he said. Does it suit you, she asked. Honestly, he looked at his plate for a moment. It suited the man I was, he said. I am not sure it suits the man I am becoming. He said it without drama, the way he said everything, as a simple statement of observed fact. She looked at him and did not look away, and neither did he. On the ride back, the sun was going down in the west in the extravagant colors that the territory produced in the winter, orange and deep red and a fringe of green along the horizon, and the cold was coming in but gently, not violently, and they were an hour from the farm when Abraham said, "My brother's name was James. He was 20 when he died. He was the funnier one and also the more reckless one, which may be why I came to favor caution." He paused. "I have not told many people about him." "Thank you for telling me," Louise said. "He would have liked you," Abraham said. "He had a fondness for people who said exactly what they meant." "I think he would have been exasperating," Louise said. "All the funniest people are." Abraham laughed, the real laugh again, and she felt again that catch in her chest, wider this time. They came back to the farm in the dark, the lantern in the window making its gold rectangle against the black sky, and she thought, that light was waiting for me. And then she thought, that is a sentimental thought, Louise. And then she thought, I do not care. I have earned sentiment. That night after dinner, Abraham took out a fiddle from behind the bedroom door. He had not mentioned it, and she had not seen it, and she looked at it with delight. You play, she said. Badly, he said, and began playing, and it was not badly at all. He played a slow air she did not know the name of, something modal and melancholy and beautiful, and she sat in the chair by the fire and listened and watched his hands on the fiddle and felt the music move through the room and into her like something necessary. When he finished, she said, That is not badly. I know 2 more songs, he said. One of them is a hymn and one of them is embarrassing. Play the embarrassing one, she said immediately. It was a reel, fast and ridiculous, and he played it with exaggerated solemnity, and she laughed so hard she had to press her hand over her mouth, and he was fighting his own smile the whole time, and by the time he finished they were both laughing properly, and the sound of it in the small warm room was the best sound she had heard in a very long time. He set the fiddle down and looked at her across the room, and the fire was low and the lamps were warm and they were both still catching their breath from laughing, and he said, Louise. Yes, she said. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want to ask it clearly so there is no confusion about what I mean. All right, she said. He was quiet for one moment, not hesitating but gathering, the way a man does when the words matter too much to be careless with. I would like you to stay, he said. Not because you have nowhere else to go, and not because it is winter and the road is difficult. I would like you to stay because... He stopped and started again, because I have been alone for a long time and I did not know until a week ago what I was missing, and now I know very precisely and I do not want to unknow it. He paused. I am not saying this well. You are saying it very well, she said. I want you to stay, he said, if you want to. And if you do not, I will saddle Birch in the morning and pack you food for a week and not say another word about it. He looked at her with those steady, dark eyes. But I wanted to say it plainly so you knew. Louise sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at him for a long, full moment. She thought about Kansas City and the empty apartment and the sold furniture and the years of work that had been fine and sufficient and utterly without the thing she was feeling right now. She thought about 300 miles of frozen territory and a name in a dead man's will and the gate she had ridden through in the last light of the afternoon, and this man standing in the lamplight with a lantern, and the snow, and the fiddle, and the cornbread, and the way he had covered her hand on the basin's edge for one brief moment and then stepped away because he was the kind of man who steps away. Abraham, she said. Yes, he said. I crossed 300 miles of territory alone in the dark of winter, she said, to deliver a piece of paper to a name in a will. The name was yours. The name was alive and waiting at the gate. She felt something unlock in her chest as she said it. I do not believe that was only about legal requirements. He was on his feet now, moving to her, and she stood up to meet him. And when he took her face in his hands, it was with the same careful, certain quality he had for everything, not tentative but not demanding, just true. The way a man touches something he has thought about honestly and has decided with his whole heart. He kissed her once gently and then pulled back and looked at her, and she looked back at him in the firelight. Stay, he said again quietly. Yes, she said, I will stay. He did not whoop or lift her or perform the moment. He pressed his forehead to hers, and she felt his breath warm and steady, and they stood like that for a moment in the low light, 2 people who had each been alone too long, in a small warm house in the New Mexico Territory in the winter of 1878. The weeks that followed were the education of each other, and Louise found it to be the most engaging thing she had undertaken in her life, which had contained some engaging things. She learned the farm, not as a visitor or a guest, but as a person who intended to know it from the ground up. She learned which of the cattle had particular temperaments and which fence posts needed replacing, and how to manage the chicken coop in cold weather to keep production up. Abraham showed her without condescension and without excessive instruction, the way you show things to someone you trust to figure it out. She showed him in return what she knew, the accounts, which he kept accurately but not efficiently, and the kitchen, which she reorganized with the pleasure of someone who enjoys systems, and a dozen small domestic efficiencies that he absorbed with genuine appreciation rather than the tolerant skepticism she had half expected. He was not proud in the foolish way. He was proud in the way that meant he had standards for himself, and when someone showed him a better way to meet those standards, he took it up gladly. In January, Abraham rode to Messilla again for provisions, and he came back with, among other things, a small packet of seeds that he set on the kitchen table and said nothing about. She picked it up and looked at it and recognized the paper as having come from the mercantile. Inside were seeds for sweet basil and a dried chili variety she had asked about offhandedly 3 weeks earlier, remembering Esperanza Garcia's kitchen. She looked at the packet and then at him. "You remembered that," she said. "I remember what you say," he said simply. She set the packet down and crossed the kitchen and kissed him, which was the first time she had done the kissing, and he was still for one surprised second before his arms came around her, and she felt him smile against her mouth. "I should buy seeds more often," he said. "Do not push it," she said, but she was smiling too. They were married in February in the church in Messilla, which was a small adobe building with thick walls and a wooden cross and the same quiet solemnity as the land itself. Eduardo Ramos stood as a witness, along with his wife Catalina and their eldest daughter, a young woman of about Louise's own age named Sophia, who had brought a wedding gift of 3 jars of preserved peaches, and wept steadily from the beginning of the ceremony to the end, with the wholehearted emotion of someone who believes completely in the occasion. The priest was Father Domings, who was older than the church, and had the unhurried quality of a man who has learned that time is more plentiful than people think. He married them in a mix of Spanish and English, and his Spanish portions had a cadence that Louise found beautiful even without understanding all of it, and she made a note to learn more Spanish. Abraham had cleaned up considerably for the occasion, his beard trimmed and his coat brushed, and he stood at the altar with the straight-backed uprightness of a man taking something seriously, which was how he took everything. When Louise walked down the short aisle toward him on Eduardo's arm, she had asked Eduardo because he was the nearest thing to family she had in the territory, and he had agreed with a gravity that told her he understood what the asking meant. Abraham's face did something private and unguarded that she would remember for the rest of her life. He looked at her the way the land looks after rain, open, relieved, as though the waiting was over. She wore a dress of green wool that she had spent a week altering from a length of fabric Abraham had brought from Messilla without telling her it was for this, which she had only discovered when she found it folded on her chair one morning with a note that said only, "For whatever you decide to use it for." She had decided to use it for her wedding dress, and she told him this at breakfast, and he nodded and drank his coffee with the suppressed satisfaction of a man whose plan had worked. The ceremony was brief and genuine, and when Father Domings told him he could kiss his bride, Abraham kissed her with the same quality he had for all important things, fully present and without performance. And Sofia Ramos wept harder and Eduardo nodded slowly as though he had expected nothing less. They celebrated at the Ramos house afterward, with food that Catalina Ramos had clearly spent several days producing. A table of tamales and beans and stewed goat and sweet corn cakes, and a cake made with honey that was the most delicious thing Louise had eaten in her life. The 3 Ramos sons, Miguel, who was 22, and Daniel, who was 19, and young Tomas, who was 16 and trying very hard to look older, played instruments, Miguel on guitar and Daniel on a small drum, and there was dancing in the yard despite the cold, because the Ramos family held that the cold was a minor inconvenience compared to the occasion. Abraham danced with her, and he was not a natural dancer in the way that some men are, but he was attentive and willing, and he moved with the same careful physical competence he brought to everything. And she did not care about any technical shortcomings because he was holding her hand and looking at her with that warm, complete expression, and the stars over the New Mexico territory were enormous and cold and near. "Are you happy?" he asked her in the dance, quietly, his mouth near her ear. She thought about the question with the honesty it deserved. She thought about Kansas City and the long years of adequate and insufficient, and she thought about the frozen road and the gate and the lantern, and she thought about seeds for sweet basil and a fiddle played by firelight, and a man who remembered what she said. "Yes," she said, and it was the simplest and most complete answer she had ever given to anything. Spring came to the territory with the drama of a long-awaited guest, sudden and gorgeous. The scrub grass going green overnight and the wildflowers spreading across the hillsides in sheets of yellow and purple. And the creek, which had been a thread of dark water under ice all winter, swelling into something broader and confident and quick. Louise planted her basil and chilies in the south-facing garden bed that she had staked out in February, and spent the first warm days of March preparing, turning the soil and amending it with the patient attention of someone who had decided to do a thing and wanted to do it right. Abraham watched her garden with an admiration he expressed in practical ways. He extended the garden fence to keep the rabbits out without being asked, and he carried water from the creek in the mornings before she woke, so there would be a full barrel at the garden's edge. And once he came home from Mesilla with a small wooden-handled trowel that was better balanced than the one she had been using, and set it on her garden gloves without comment. She found the trowel and called to him from the garden and held it up. "Abraham Trask," she said. "Yes," he said from the porch. "Stop buying me things," she said. "I will not," he said, and went back inside. She planted the trowel in the soil and sat back on her heels and looked at the spring sky and smiled until her face ached. They hired a hand in April, a young man named Will Cafferty who was 17 and had come from Texas with nothing but a horse and the willingness to work, and a letter of recommendation from a preacher in El Paso that was so enthusiastic in its praise that Abraham had been suspicious of it, until he met the boy and found every word of it to be accurate. Will was quiet and capable, and had a talent with the cattle that was almost intuitive, and he built himself a small room at the end of the barn and treated the farm as though it were a thing worth caring for, which was all Abraham had ever asked of anyone. With Will to help with the cattle and fences, Abraham had more time for the other work of the farm, and he turned that time partly toward expanding the property. He negotiated with a neighboring landowner to lease an additional 20 acres to the north, and he began the slow work of breaking new ground for a larger herd in the autumn. Louise, in that same spring, discovered that she was going to have a child. She knew before she told Abraham, in the way that women know things, living with the knowledge for a private week, while she let it settle into her understanding of her life. She told him on a Sunday morning in May when the world was warm and flowering, and the creek was singing outside the window, and she sat him down at the kitchen table and told him plainly, because plainly was the only way she knew to say important things. His face went through several expressions rapidly: surprise, comprehension, something she could only describe as wonder, and then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it carefully, the way you hold something you know to be precious, and said, "Louise." "Yes," she said. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, otherwise very well." He nodded slowly. He was still holding her hand and looking at her with that open expression. "I did not think," he said, and stopped. "I did not let myself think about this, about any of it, before you came." He paused. "I did not think this kind of life was available to me." "It was always available to you," she said. "You just needed someone to bring the deed in person." He laughed, and she laughed, and the morning light poured through the window and the creek sang outside, and she felt completely, fully, entirely where she was supposed to be. The summer was rich and hot and busy, and Louise's pregnancy settled into her life with a directness that suited her. She did not slow down so much as redirect, spending less time in the fields and more time in the house, adding to the small room off the kitchen that would become a nursery, making things with her hands in the evenings while Abraham read or played the fiddle. She wrote to Father Domings in Mesilla asking about names, not because she was religious in the formal way, but because she had liked the cadence of his Spanish and wanted the child to have a name that carried something of this place. She also wrote a letter to the solicitor in Kansas City, telling him the deed had been delivered and the legal matter concluded and the land transferred to the Ramos family by the named beneficiary's choice. She wrote it clearly and with the professional brevity of a businesswoman, and then on a second sheet she wrote a personal note to the solicitor, whose name was Arthur Henley, and who had been kind to her in the weeks after Clement's death, thanking him for his patience, and telling him she was married and well and living in New Mexico territory. She told him that her uncle's last act, which had seemed at the time like a strange and inconvenient thing, had turned out to be the most significant thing Clement Shelton had ever done for her. She told him she was grateful. Henley wrote back in September with congratulations and the information that the legal matter was fully closed and that her name would not be required again in any capacity, and that he was very glad to hear she was happy. He also enclosed a small photograph of Clement Shelton that he had found in the papers of the estate and not known what to do with, a man of perhaps 50, standing outside a farmhouse with his hat in his hand and a direct, steady look at the camera that Louise recognized as belonging to her family, and she looked at it for a long time and felt the particular species of grief that has no edges, the kind that is also love. She put the photograph on the mantelpiece above the fireplace, where it stood beside a small piece of ironwood that Abraham had shaped into the form of a running horse and given her in the early spring for no occasion except that he had made it. Those two objects on the mantel, the dead man's photograph and the hand-carved horse, seemed to her to contain the whole story of how she had come to be here, and she was at peace with all of it. In October, 2 days before the first anniversary of her arrival at Abraham's gate, their son was born. The labor was long, and Catalina Ramos came to help, arriving in the early morning with her elder daughter Sophia and a basket of things that women who know about these things bring. And the day was hard but not frightening, and Abraham stayed as close as Catalina allowed, which was in the kitchen, where she could hear him moving back and forth and the sound of the fire and the boiling water, and once the quiet crash of a pot that suggested he had startled badly at a sound from the bedroom. When Catalina finally opened the bedroom door and told him he could come in, he came in with the expression of a man who has been through something and is not yet certain it is over. Louise was in the bed with the baby at her chest, and she was tired in a bone-deep, complete way that was not unpleasant, and she looked at Abraham's face when he first saw the child, and she thought she would remember that face for the rest of her life as she would remember his face at the altar in Mesilla, open, unguarded, fully arrived. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms with the careful instruction that Catalina had just given her, and he held the child with the same careful certainty with which he held everything important. "A boy," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the child's face. "He looks like someone who already has opinions," he said. "That is a Shelton trait," Louise said. "I hope it is also a Trask trait," Abraham said. "Then he is doubly doomed," she said. He looked up at her with that expression she had learned was happiness, the real kind, the kind that is not performed. "What do we call him?" he said. She had been thinking about this for weeks. "Clement," she said. "Clement James Trask." He was quiet for a moment, understanding both names without needing to ask. His brother James and her uncle Clement. The two men whose absence had led both of them to this moment. "Yes," he said. "Clement James Trask." Catalina Ramos, who had not left the room, made a soft sound of approval from the corner. Clement James Trask was an opinionated and vigorous child from his first week of life, and he grew into a boy with his father's steady eyes and his mother's sharp mind, and a laugh that was his own, unattributed, belonging only to him. He was running before he was walking, which Catalina said meant he had ambitions, and he followed his father around the farm at the first opportunity with the total absorption of a small boy who has found his primary object of study. Will Cafferty, who was 18 now and growing into a young man of considerable quality, was Clement's second object of study, primarily because Will could do things on horseback that defied the expectations of the casual observer. By the time Clement was 3, he was trying to climb the fence of the corral to get closer to the horses, and Abraham had to make a decision between discouragement, which would fail, and proper instruction, which might succeed, and being Abraham he chose instruction. Louise watched her husband teach their son about horses with a quiet and sustained pleasure that was one of the ongoing great satisfactions of her life. She watched the way Abraham had with the boy, patient and honest, not reducing the child's intelligence by simplifying things too much, not overwhelming him with complexity. It was the same way he had with everything, careful, direct, respectful. Their second child came in the spring of 1882, a daughter they named Clara Rose Trask, who was from her first breath a different creature entirely from her brother, quieter, watchful, with her father's attentiveness and her mother's dark eyes. Clara was the kind of child who sat still and watched a thing for a long time before approaching it, and who, once she had decided to approach it, approached it with complete commitment. She and Clement were different in nearly every way and loved each other with the particular fierce competitive affection of siblings who recognize each other as their equal. The farm grew. Abraham's additional 20 acres in the north came fully into production by 1881, and he expanded the herd to 30 cattle, which was as large as he wanted to go and still maintain the quality of care he believed animals deserved. Will Cafferty, by now 21 and entirely capable of running the cattle side of the operation without supervision, stayed on not merely because the work was good but because, as he once told Louise with the directness of someone who has thought carefully about what he values, this was the best place he had ever worked and he intended to stay as long as he was wanted. "You will be wanted," Louise told him, "until you decide otherwise." He nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am," in the way that meant, "That is all I needed to hear." The Ramos family on their additional 60 acres from Kansas had prospered in the years since. Eduardo had subdivided the Kansas land so that each of his older sons had their own acreage, and the two families, Trask and Ramos, had developed the kind of neighborly friendship that is built from years of small, reliable acts, borrowed tools and shared harvests and children playing together in the yards. Sophia Ramos, who had wept at the wedding, had become one of Louise's closest friends, and they spent Sunday afternoons together on a rotating basis, cooking and talking and watching the children, and the friendship was one of the things Louise had not expected from the West and was most grateful for. In the summer of 1883, when Clement was not quite 3 years old and Clara was still a baby, and the farm was in the fullness of its good middle years, Louise and Abraham sat on the porch in the evening after supper. The children were asleep. The sky over the territory was the deep blue of a summer night, enormous and star-thick, and the air was warm and smelled of dry grass and the juniper that grew along the creek. The fiddle was leaning against the wall beside the door, and Abraham had played after dinner, not the reel this time but the slow air she had heard the first evening, and the children had fallen asleep to it, and now the fiddle was at rest. They sat in the 2 chairs they had moved to the porch for exactly this purpose in the evenings when the weather allowed, and she was mending something, and he had a cup of coffee, and there was no particular necessity for conversation, which was why the conversation they had was honest. "Do you ever think about Kansas City?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "The way you think about a place you left before it could finish with you. I think I was not finished when I left, and I noticed that sometimes." She paused. "But I am not sorry to have left. Do you miss it?" "I miss the idea of it," she said, "what I thought it might become, but the real thing was never as good as the idea." She looked at him. "This is the real thing." He nodded slowly, the way he absorbed things. "I have been thinking about the will," he said. "What about it?" she said. "About what Clement intended," he said. "I have wondered these 5 years whether he meant it only as a bequest, the land," he looked at the dark yard, "or whether he understood something I did not yet know about myself." She set down her mending and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said carefully, "that the only way you came here was the will. And the only way I have this," he gestured, not specifically but broadly, meaning all of it, the farm and the children asleep inside and the night air and her, "is because he wrote my name." He paused. "Clement Shelton never asked me anything. He stayed 3 weeks and told stories and helped with the fences and went north. But he knew me. And he sent you." Louise was quiet for a moment. The stars over the territory were extraordinary, and she had never quite stopped being astonished by them, which she considered a good sign. "I think he sent the deed," she said, "and I think I chose the rest." "Yes," Abraham said, "I think that is exactly right." She picked up the mending again, and he drank his coffee, and the night was large and quiet around them. "The photograph on the mantel," she said after a while. "Yes," he said. "I want to take Clement to Kansas when he is older," she said, "to see the land, the Ramos land now, but the land that was Clement's, the land he cared for." She paused. "I want the boy to know where his name comes from." "We will take him," Abraham said. "And tell him the story," she said. "What story?" Abraham asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he wanted to hear her tell it. She smiled. "The story of a woman who crossed the territory alone in the dark season," she said, "to deliver a dead man's deed to a name she did not know. And the name was alive and waiting at the gate, and it turned out to be the end of one kind of loneliness and the beginning of everything else." She heard him put his coffee cup down on the porch rail, and then his hand was over hers on the arm of the chair, the way it had been on the basin's edge in that first week, the way it always was, not taking, not demanding, just true. "That is a good story," he said. "It is my favorite story," she said. "It has a very good ending." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it in a gesture she would not have predicted from him in those first days, and which she had discovered was one of his particular habits in moments of tenderness, this quiet, unhurried acknowledgement. "Not ending," he said. "Continuing." She turned her hand to hold his, and they sat in the warmth of the summer night, the fiddle against the wall and the children sleeping and the stars turning slowly over the territory. And she thought about the frozen road and the cottonwoods on the rise and the gate in the last gray light, and she thought, "I did not know. I could not have known. I was riding toward a name, and a name is a small thing, a few letters in a dead man's hand, and what I found was this. A man and a farm and a life, and a son named for 2 absences, and a daughter with watching eyes, and a friendship that smelled of tamales and lavender, and a spring garden with basil in it, and a fiddle that played slow airs in the evening, and the particular quality of silence in the New Mexico territory that was different from any silence she had known before, and that she had now known long enough to call her own. She thought about all of it, and she was grateful without reservation, and she held the hand of Abraham Trask in the warm night and looked at the stars until the weariness of the day finally claimed her, and she said, "I am going to sleep." "Go in," he said. "I will sit a while." She stood and pressed her hand against his shoulder as she passed, and he reached up briefly and covered her hand with his, and she went inside to the warm house and the sleeping children, and she lay down in the bed they had shared for 5 years, and listened to the small sounds of the farm and the night, and after a while, the quiet opening of the door and his footsteps on the floor and the soft weight of the bed taking him in, and she turned toward him without waking, and he settled beside her without speaking. And the house was warm and full and complete, and outside the territory was large and dark and full of stars, and this was the life that a dead man's handwriting had made possible. And it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything. 3 years later, in the autumn of 1886, they added a room to the south side of the house. It was Abraham's idea, presented to Louise one morning over coffee with the directness she had always loved in him. A blueprint he had drawn himself on a sheet of heavy paper, simple and functional, showing a room with 2 windows and a door that opened to the south garden. "What is the room for?" she asked, studying the drawing. "A library," he said, "and a place for you to work. You have been doing the accounts at the kitchen table for 8 years, and it is not enough space." She looked at the drawing for a long moment. "A library," she said. "You have been buying books," he said. "The shelf is full." She looked up at him. "You noticed the shelf was full." "I notice everything you do," he said, and said it with the simplicity that always disarmed her, as though noticing her was not a decision he made but a condition he was in. They built the room that autumn, with the help of Will and the 2 older Ramos boys, Miguel and Daniel, who had grown into excellent carpenters in the way that men who build their own houses on their own land tend to do. The room was finished before the cold came, and Louise moved her accounts into it and her books, and the small desk that had been Clement Shelton's. She had written to Arthur Henley in Kansas City, and asked if there was anything from the estate that might be shipped, and he had arranged for the desk to come west on the railway and the stagecoach, and finally a wagon from Mesilla. Arriving battered and magnificent and smelling faintly of her uncle, and she sat at the desk in the new room with the winter light coming through the south windows, and felt that something had been set right that she had not known was crooked. Abraham looked in at her from the doorway that first evening. Clement, 9 now and tall for his age, was sitting on the floor of the room reading a book about the habits of horses that he had read approximately 12 times, and Clara, 4 and newly opinionated, was sitting in the corner, arranging a collection of smooth stones in patterns whose logic was her own and not to be questioned. Louise was at the desk with the farm ledger open before her, making neat columns of numbers in the lamplight, and she looked up and found Abraham in the doorway, and his face had that expression, the one she knew as thoroughly as she knew the farm, the one that was love without embellishment. "Good," he said. "Very good," she said. He nodded and went back to the kitchen and the sound of his evening routine, and she listened to the house, his footsteps and the children's voices, and the fire settling in the hearth and the wind outside that was bringing the smell of the first cold, and she wrote the numbers in the ledger with a steady hand and was at peace. In the spring of 1887, Louise found a woman at the gate. She was perhaps 20, and she was on foot, which in this country was a statement of extreme circumstance, and she was carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth that turned out to contain an infant of some weeks. She had come from the East, she said, when Louise had brought her inside and put coffee in her hands. Her name was Anna Briggs, and she had been a cook at a cattle ranch outside of Lincoln until the ranch had changed owners, and the new management had made the situation untenable in ways she described with quiet, precise language that told Louise the situation had been worse than the words. She had no family in the territory, and she had heard there was a farm at Sweetwater Creek where the people were decent. "Who told you that?" Louise asked. "Sophia Ramos," the young woman said. Louise fed her and let her rest and put the baby in Clara's crib. Clara was old enough for a proper bed now, and had made this clear at considerable volume for some months, and when Abraham came in from the field she told him about it simply, and he listened without expression and then said, "Can she cook?" Louise gave him a look. "I am asking because Will has been complaining that my cornbread is not as good as yours," he said, "which is correct. And you have been trying to do too many things at once since Clara was born." "I manage," Louise said. "You do," he said. "But you should not have to manage so hard when it is unnecessary." He looked at her steadily. "If she wants to stay and she is willing to work, she is welcome." Anna Briggs stayed, and she could cook, which settled the cornbread question and several others besides. She was quiet and competent and had a fierceness under her stillness that Louise recognized and respected, and the baby, a boy named Robert, whom Anna called Bobby, grew into a healthy and cheerful child, who was adopted by the general community of the farm with the ease that young children are adopted by people who are fundamentally kind. Ana had been there 3 months when she met Miguel Ramos, who had come to help Abraham with the roof of the barn after a section had been damaged in a spring storm. Miguel was 28 and had the same careful steadiness as his father, and he and Ana were introduced over the lunch Louise had brought out to the yard for the working men, and Louise watched from the kitchen window as Miguel held his hat in his hands and said something that made Ana look at him with the specific attention that means a person is deciding something. She told Abraham that night. He listened with the satisfaction of a man who is not surprised. "I wondered," he said. "You wondered," she said. "Miguel has been quiet for 3 years," he said, "since the girl he was courting in Mesilla married someone else. He has been the kind of quiet that is looking for the right occasion." He paused. "Ana is a very specific occasion." "You think about people," Louise said. "Yes," he said. "I thought that was my trait," she said. "You taught it to me," he said. She looked at him across the room and felt the long familiar catch, wider now than it had been at the beginning, stretched by years into something that was less sharp and more encompassing, like a river versus a creek. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the bench by the fire, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him and they listened to the house. The children upstairs, the fire, the wind outside doing its territorial business. Miguel Ramos and Ana Briggs were married the following spring in the same church in Mesilla, where Abraham and Louise had married 9 years before. Father Domings, who was apparently ageless, performed the ceremony with the same unhurried gravity, and Sophia Ramos wept from beginning to end, and Clement Trask, now 10, stood very straight as a witness and took the responsibility seriously, and Clara, 5 and dressed in a white dress that she had strong opinions about, carried flowers with the absolute conviction of someone who has been waiting for an appropriate occasion to carry flowers. Bobby Ramos now toddled in the aisle and had to be periodically redirected by Louise, who managed this without breaking her composure, which Abraham observed with the quiet admiration that had been one of the steady undertones of their marriage for a decade. Afterward, there was food and music in the yard, and the same warmth of the same people who had been gathered for important occasions since Louise had arrived at the gate 9 years ago, and the evening was long and golden and full of laughter. Abraham found Louise near the end of the evening, standing at the edge of the yard looking north, the direction from which she had come. She was not often given to looking that way anymore, and when she did he had learned to simply stand with her, not asking, waiting. "I was thinking about the road," she said after a while. "The road from Kansas City," he said. "Yes," she said. "The Cimarron crossing, the way the cold felt, the cottonwoods on the ridge." She paused. How strange it was to be heading toward something I could not see. She turned to look at him. "I was so frightened and I would not admit it to myself. I kept thinking, I am doing a practical thing. I am delivering a document, that is all." "Was that all?" he said. "No," she said. "I think I was also trying to find something. I did not have a word for it at the time. I thought it was just the will and the legal requirements and the taxes." She looked at the dark northern horizon. "But I think I was riding toward the possibility that something could still be different, that the life I had been living was not the only available life." He was quiet beside her. "And then you were standing at the gate with a lantern," she said. "In a canvas coat that had seen better days," he said. "It was a good coat," she said. "It was not," he said. She laughed and he smiled, and they stood together in the evening with the music behind them and the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and she took his arm and leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the warmth and solidity of him, the 10 years' worth of him that she knew as well as she knew her own name. "Are you glad?" she said. "For all of it?" He turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair. "Every day," he said, "without exception." The years continued in the way of good years, which is to say with the full texture of ordinary life difficulty and ease in roughly even measure, seasons that were hard and seasons that were generous, the children growing with the speed that children grow when you are watching, and the slowness that they grow when you are waiting for them. The farm adapting to each year's particular demands with the flexibility that comes from two people working alongside each other in long-established trust. Clement Trask grew into a young man with his father's hands and his mother's tongue, meaning he was good with horses and eloquent about it. By 16, he was the primary handler of the farm's horses, a responsibility he had claimed so gradually and so competently that it was not a moment of formal assignment, but simply a fact that everyone recognized simultaneously. He had also, by 16, developed a deep interest in veterinary medicine that had no immediate outlet in Sweetwater Creek, but that Louise fed with every book and pamphlet and periodical she could find, because she had learned from her own history that an interest precisely maintained through a difficult period can become a livelihood in better conditions. Clara Trask, by contrast, was going to be a teacher. She announced this at the age of 7 and did not change her mind, which her parents took seriously because Clara had never changed her mind about anything material. And by the time she was 12, she was already helping the younger children of the Ramos family with their letters and numbers, a role she inhabited with the natural authority of someone who has found their purpose early and is grateful for the clarity. Louise wrote to a school in Santa Fe about Clara when the girl was 14, inquiring about the possibility of a formal teaching certificate in 2 years' time, and received in reply a letter from the school's administrator, a woman named Margaret Dowell, which Louise found significant and encouraging, explaining the requirements and the curriculum and the costs. She showed the letter to Clara that evening, and Clara read it twice with great seriousness, and then looked up with an expression so concentrated and determined that Louise almost laughed. "I will need to improve my arithmetic," Clara said. "Your arithmetic is excellent," Louise said. "It needs to be better than excellent," Clara said. "Then we will make it better than excellent," Louise said. Abraham, who had been reading by the fire and listening to this exchange, turned a page of his book and said without looking up, "She already gets it from both sides." He turned another page. "The poor arithmetic will not stand a chance." Clara looked at her father with the narrowed eyes of someone deciding whether this counts as encouragement or criticism, and then apparently deciding it was both and was appropriate, and went back to the letter. In 1895, Clement was 19 and had applied to study veterinary medicine at a school in St. Louis, Missouri, and Louise and Abraham drove him to the stagecoach in Mesilla on an October morning that was cold and clear and beautiful. Clement was trying very hard to look as though leaving was not difficult, which was a Trask trait and also a Shelton trait, and Louise watched him with the particular mixture of pride and grief that is the specific texture of letting a child go. She hugged him hard and he held on longer than she expected, and she felt him breathe once deeply and then straighten. "Write every week," she said. "Every 2 weeks," he said. "Every week," she said. "Every 10 days," he said, and she saw the corner of his mouth, and she understood that he was negotiating because he was trying not to cry. "Fine," she said. "Every 10 days, but the first letter in 3 days." "Done," he said. He shook his father's hand, and then Abraham pulled him in for a brief, hard embrace, and Clement ducked his head against his father's shoulder for 1 second before stepping back and composing himself and picking up his bag. "Take care of mother," he told his father, in the tone of a young man who is managing his own feelings by attending to the feelings of others. "I have been doing that for 17 years, Abraham said. "I am fairly competent at it by now." Clement grinned, the real grin, the one that was entirely himself, and got into the stage. Clara got her teaching certificate in 1897 and came home for the summer before taking a position at the school in Mesilla, which was near enough for regular visits and far enough for proper independence, and which she inhabited with the absolute authority and genuine devotion that her students would later, in their own adult recollections, describe as the defining quality of their primary education. The farm in those later years had found its equilibrium, 30 acres under active cultivation, a cattle herd maintained by Will Cafferty, who was 35 and as much a part of the property as the fence posts, and a household that was smaller now with the children gone but not quieter, because Louise had learned over the years that quiet was not the same as peace, and that what she had this ongoing conversation with Abraham Trask, this daily negotiation of two lives fully combined, was better than quiet by every measure she could name. On a December evening in 1898, exactly 20 years since Louise had ridden down the slope from the cottonwoods and dismounted in the yard, she stood at the gate. She had walked out to close it for the night, which was her custom, and she stood there for a moment with her hand on the latch. The gate was different. The original had rotted out years ago and been replaced, and the replacement had been replaced once more since then. And this one was solid oak with iron hardware that Abraham had traded for in Mesilla. The yard behind her was the same yard and also a different yard, fuller now with 20 years of life. The garden larger and better established and full of things Esperanza Garcia had never imagined growing in New Mexico territory, and the barn expanded and solid, and the house with its south room full of books. She looked north, up the slope toward the cottonwoods on the ridge. They were bare in the December dark, 3 silver shapes against the sky, unchanged. She had walked up to them once in her first spring here and stood between their trunks and looked south at the farm below, and understood what the storekeeper in Mesilla had meant by a landmark. They were the kind of trees that drew the eye, standing separate and distinct, a thing to ride toward. She heard footsteps behind her and did not turn. Abraham came to stand beside her and looked north with her. "I was thinking about the first night," she said. "What about it?" he said. "I was so cold," she said, "and so determined to be practical about everything. I kept thinking, this is a legal errand, this is a requirement, I am fulfilling an obligation." She shook her head slowly. "I was so afraid to want what I was wanting." "What were you wanting?" he said. "This," she said simply. He was quiet beside her for a moment. The cold was the same kind of cold it had been that night 20 years ago, the particular dry cold of the territory in December, and the stars were the same enormous present stars, and the cottonwoods on the ridge were 3 pale shapes in the dark. "I was standing in the barn when I heard the horse," he said. "I thought it was a stray. I came out with the lantern." He paused. "And there you were." "There I was," she said. "Covered in trail dust and absolutely composed," he said. "Like you had ridden to the end of the earth and it was nothing." "It was not nothing," she said. "I was terrified." "You did not look it," he said. "I had 300 miles of practice by then," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood at the gate in the December dark, looking north at the slope and the cottonwoods and the dark sky beyond. "Clement is coming for Christmas," she said. "He wrote from St. Louis. He has news he wants to tell us in person." "What kind of news?" Abraham said. "He did not say," she said, "but the letter had a quality." "A quality," Abraham said. "The kind of quality a letter has when the writer is happy about something specific," she said. "When a person is about to tell you they have met someone." Abraham was quiet for a moment. "He is 23, he said. "A fine age," she said. "I was 30 when I met you," he said. "And I was 24, she said. "And we were not too young or too old. We were exactly the age we needed to be." She paused. "Clement has always been ready for things ahead of schedule, like his sister." Abraham nodded slowly. "If he has found someone," he said, "we will welcome them." "Of course we will," Louise said. "The house is large enough," he said, "now that the south room is built." "It is always large enough," she said. "That has never been the question." He tightened his arm around her shoulders, and she felt the warmth of him against the December cold. And she looked at the gate and the yard and the lit windows of the house. And she thought about a woman on a gray horse riding through the last light toward a name she did not know, and about that name being alive and warm and standing in the lamplight with a question in his face, and about every day since. The stew and the fiddle and the seeds and the children, and the desk that smelled of her uncle and the marriage in the small adobe church, and the room of books and the 2 children who were out in the world making their own lives. And she felt, as she had felt every day for 20 years, the same clean certainty. She had been right to come. She had been right to stay. She had been right to want what she wanted. She unlatched the gate and latched it again firmly. the sound of the iron on iron in the cold air final and sure, and she turned toward the house and the warm light of the windows, and Abraham's hand was at her back, steady and present, and they walked up the yard together through the December dark, through the cold that was the same cold it had always been, toward the door of the house that held everything that mattered. The stars over the New Mexico territory were large and close and indifferent to human particulars, which was a comfort in its way. The same stars above grief and above joy, above the frozen road and above the warm hearth, above the gate and the cottonwoods and the long slope of the years. And they turned overhead in their patient, constant way as the door of the Trask farmhouse opened and the light came out. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything, and it was still going.